AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have a very interesting guest. He is a historian and an author who writes true spy stories. It's very, very interesting. His name is Alexander Rose. He was born in the U.S., grew up in Australia, educated in the U.K., worked in Canada, and now lives in New York. He has a doctorate in history from Cambridge. He was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2020, and he's also a member of the Royal Historic Society. His first book, which is very well known to our audience, is Washington Spies, the first story of American spy ring. But he has a brand new book out entitled The Lion and the Fox. Alex, welcome to AFIO Now.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jim. Or James, or Jim, I'm not sure how formal are we here?
No. So, Alex, this is a really wonderful true story about espionage in the UK during the Civil War. How serious was the Union blockade of southern ports during the Civil War?
Well, it was a little like that. I think as we've discovered, blockades, embargoes, boycotts, all that sort of stuff, they take a very long time to actually work their magic, as you found out from Iraq and as currently with Mr. Putin and Russia and various other examples, North Korea. But so what happened at the beginning of the Civil War was that Lincoln, at the very beginning, imposed a blockade of the South. And it was supposed to be kind of a pressure. It was almost like I think it was like to an anaconda, kind of slowly constricting its hapless prey. Of course, as I said, it takes a very long time for this stuff to work. And as the South well knew, the South had several assets, and is that this was basically a 3,500 mile long coast going all the way from the Rio Grande up to Virginia, essentially, with hundreds of inlets and bays and rivers and streams and all this kind of stuff. There's no way that the U.S. Navy could blockade it all, especially since I think the U.S. Navy at the beginning of the war could maybe scrape together about 40 ships, and half of those were kind of sort of tin pot ships that really should have been scrapped already. You can't blockade something, a coastline as long as that. So on the face of it, the blockade could never work. But on the other hand, it could work in the sense that, as Lincoln just realized, you don't have to block the entire 3,500 mile coastline. You just have to block the sort of 6 or 7 deep water ports and make sure that no Southern ships come out of there. There is no Southern Navy to speak of. I think the Confederate Navy had one ship at the time. So the point of all this was to persuade the South to just essentially come to heel. And the South did not want to come to heel. And so they determined that they were going to break this blockade by hook or by crook. And by doing that, they would swarm the relative handful of U.S. Navy ships offshore with just dozens or scores or hundreds of sort of fleet blockade, or essentially blockade runners, to smuggle cotton out and to bring guns and munitions into the South. So yeah, it was a serious thing, the blockade, but it wasn't working, especially if the South is determined to break it.
Alex, how involved was Britain in the cotton trade, and how did that influence its attitudes toward the South?
British attitudes towards the South, not only the South, but the North as well, are really very interesting. They're not really looked at often enough. But you have to remember, first, that Britain was essentially the United States of its day. It was even more so. It was a hyperpower. It was the biggest trade on the planet, had the biggest, the Royal Navy threw into shadows the rest of the world's navies combined, kind of thing. And they have a vested interest in the freedom of the seas, keeping the trade routes open. Britain is also a free trading nation at that time anyway. The South are also free traders. I mean, not free laborers, but free traders. The North were essentially the tariff protectionists, which also automatically puts them kind of on a bit of friction with the British government. So the Britons are kind of sympathetic to the South for several reasons, one of which, as I said, is the economics of the trade. The second is that there was a kind of a sort of slightly misty-eyed, sort of rose-colored spectacled view of all these Southern aristocrats luxuriating on their plantations. It was just like being in the House of Lords. There was a bit of that too. They seemed to be more gentlemanly than these vulgar, upstart, northern, pushy businessmen. But there was also power play as well, and that was a United States is potentially a major competitor to the British Empire. So wouldn't it be nicer if there were two of them, one in the north, one in the south, and you kind of play them off against each other? It's like basically European power politics, great power politics. You just split and conquer and divide, kind of, or divide and conquer, rather. So there's a little bit of that. On the other hand, the Britons have to think to themselves, do we really want to encourage the South with this rebellion? And we have to remember that Britain is an imperial power. It has colonies all over the world, India, Egypt, especially in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, Jamaica, and all these kind of places. Is it a good idea, do you think, to encourage, say, one bunch of people to rebel against rightful authority? Because if you encourage the South in this, then surely the Jamaicans could start getting ideas. What about the Indians, the jewel in the crown? What happens if they get similar ideas to break away? So again, at the same time, they have to be very careful not to overtly encourage the South, while at the same time kind of undermining the North, you see? So the British have a very complicated relationship. And then, of course, there's the slavery issue as well. Nobody in Britain was in favor of slavery. They had already abolished the slave trade decades earlier. They thought it was awful. They just kind of assumed that it would go away of its own accord. And this was a story that was put around at the time, that it would just kind of vanish over the next couple of decades, and that would be the end of it. So the British attitudes towards the Civil War are actually, they're very complex, but they're also very confused. There's a sort of a funny letter from, I think, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Russell, Earl Russell, to the Prime Minister saying, who knows with these people, let's just stay out of this until essentially we know who the winner is, and then we'll come in. So, and there's another one where he says, we've tried to intervene, we've tried to talk sense into these Northerners and these Southerners, but they're just like mad dogs fighting amongst each other. We have nothing to do with this. Let's just stay away. And the French agreed with this as well. So that's a sort of kind of long-winded answer to a very simple question.
Who are some of the principal characters in the story?
Well, the two major characters, the way the book is structured, is that essentially it's like I don't know if you remember this from Mad Magazine. Remember you have the spy versus spy, and we have the white spy and the black spy, and they both kind of chase each other around. That's kind of the image that I had in my head when I was writing it. And so you have James Bulock, who was the Confederate agent, secret agent, confidential agent, sent by Stephen Mallory, the Secretary of the Confederate Navy, to Liverpool in England, which was one of the most powerful cities in the world at the time. We can talk about that a little later if you want. And his job was to essentially buy or commission or acquire somehow a secret navy, because the South can't build its own navy. It just doesn't have the industrial capacity for it. It can't even build the engines for steam engines for these things. It doesn't have the steel and the iron or the resources or the skill to build a fleet. So they have to get one from abroad. And luckily, Liverpool is highly sympathetic to the Confederacy and for the cotton trade and for that kind of thing. And they will sell him whatever he needs, you see. Blockade runners, commerce raiders, and essentially ironclads. So he's the first guy there. To stop him, the North sends a man called Thomas Dudley, who's this rather harmless Quaker abolitionist consul who happened to be there, thinking that this was just going to be kind of an easy retirement job for a year. And it turns out he inherited the most important intelligence posting in the entire world. So it's his job to stop Bulock from acquiring this navy, you see. And so that's the sort of the structure of the book. The two of them trying to run rings around each other. I'd say it's more like Tom and Jerry, but it's not really cat and mouse. It's sort of cat and cat. I think is probably the best way to describe that relationship. And but it continues for the entire war. One's up, one's down, one's down, one's up. There's a few more sort of big players. There's a man called Charles Prelow, who's essentially the Confederacy's dark financier there. He's the guy who funds Bulock through the cotton trade. Who else is? A guy called Moran, who's this morose diplomat at the American embassy in London. There's a whole bunch of sort of supporting characters. They're all very colorful in that great Victorian way. But the two center ones are those ones. But to get back to your earlier question about, which I sort of completely forgot to answer, which was Britain's attitude towards cotton. So let me start there. And the fact is that for Britain, cotton was a narcotic. It was dependent on Southern cotton to feed its economy. There's a great statistic that says that something like a fifth, fully 20% of the British population was directly or indirectly employed or related to the cotton trade. So without the cotton trade, you've got major problems. So essentially the way it worked is that Southern cotton was the best cotton in the world. The British had tried to grow it in India. They tried to grow it in Egypt. It just didn't work. The only place you could get real primo grade cotton, the white gold, as it was known, was from the South, where it was backbreakingly picked by millions of slaves and then shipped out to Liverpool, where there was one of the world's first futures exchanges. It was a Liverpool cotton exchange, where there were hundreds or thousands of brokers and agents dealing in cotton. They would come in, they would sell it to and ship it to, take it by train rather, to the big factories in Lancashire, near Manchester and so on, that would take this raw cotton and turn it into textiles, to basic clothing, or it could be really high-end stuff, and then it would be re-exported to the rest of the world at this great markup. So that's the great profit motive. People forget how important cotton was in the 19th century. It was the biggest business in the world. It was huge amounts of money, and the South is dependent on that money coming in to fund its war effort. You see,
Alex, describe for our audience the Port of Liverpool in the 1860s. And what role did its bankers and merchants and shipbuilders play in all of this?
We tend to think nowadays of Liverpool as sort of the home of John and Paul and Ringo and George, Liverpool United or something. It wasn't like that at all in the 1860s. Liverpool was kind of a sort of a combination of, it was basically the sort of the Jerusalem of finance and crime, for that matter, in that era. It was colossally wealthy through what had been in the 18th century, the slave trade with the South. And then once that had been abolished, basically the same merchants went into business with Southern plantation owners and went into the cotton trade. So it was all of those huge numbers of canals and those grand public buildings that you see in railway stations that you see in England are basically financed by cotton, the cotton trade in the early to mid 19th century. It is worth an unbelievable amount of money that is streaming into Liverpool. And so it's colossally wealthy. It has hundreds of brokers and, as I said, agents, bankers, managers, all this kind of stuff, traders, ship owners, everything there. And it's also one of the great, I think there were more ships built in Liverpool each year than in the rest of the world combined. That's how powerful this place is. It had, I think, 15 miles of shipyards along its rivers and coastline. So those are the two major businesses there. It was also extremely violent. Unbelievably violent and crime-ridden. So it's a little like Blade Runner, where you have the very rich, and then you have very poor people at the end, whereas everyone else is kind of cleared out to the alien worlds. But so it's basically the most violent place not only in the country, but probably in Europe. Huge numbers. It's all fueled by booze, essentially. And you have also thousands of it's a very sort of multicultural place in one sense of the term, in the sense that you have thousands of sailors there from around the world. You have I think Herman Melville visited, and he said it was like a grand parliament of masts in the docking bays. You just have ships from all around the world with all the different designs, and you have Malays and Indians and Chinese and Japanese and Frenchmen and Dutchmen. I mean, it's just everybody is there. It's this incredible place. So that's what I wanted to get across in the book, that Liverpool was one hell of a city at the time. And it's also a brilliant place to conduct an intelligence war.
What were some of Bulock's early successes?
Well, Bulock started off on the best foot forward. The Union had initially, when he got there, basically a Union chief of intelligence, a very entertaining fellow called Sanford, who I devote a chapter to, who's one of these grand eccentrics of the Victorian tradition, quite wealthy, devoted to the Union, really in love with what would later become known as black operations. Really loves them. And he gets a crew together of sort of similar mercenaries and adventurers, people who'd been pirates in the Mediterranean and blown up railways in Italy and all this kind of stuff. But he tries to, as he said, basically take out the Confederacy by any means possible, which of course causes the British to go nuts, because he is trying to blow up ships in the River Thames, which you can't really do. He goes up against Bulock. Bulock outwits him, makes him look like a fool. I mean, he just out-cunnings, if that's the right word, the entire Union organization. Sanford's then sent home and kind of with his tail between his legs, and that's the end of it. That's when Dudley comes into the picture. But Dudley is a newbie. He's not a spy. It sounds like he was trained to do any of this stuff. He doesn't know anything about it. He's just a consul, and a consul essentially just rubber stamps people's passports and bails drunken sailors out of prison and sends them home with a couple of bucks in their pocket. So Bulock is running rings around him, you see, and he does. He's sending out blockade runners to Liverpool, to the south. They are bringing in thousands and thousands of bales of cotton smuggled in, which was going to be converted to fund the Confederate war effort. He is sending ships full of arms and weapons to the south, and he builds what would become CSS Florida, which is the first of the great commerce raiders. And he builds it right in front of Dudley, who doesn't see it because it's camouflaged as a merchant vessel. It's a complicated story. So he is running rings around the Union. I mean, he has everything in his corner. Liverpool is on his side. All of the bankers are on his side. The cotton merchants are on his side. The sailors are on his side. Dudley is all alone. But he has to. And the part of the story is that he essentially learns how to spy. He learns how the game is played. And it takes him some time, but eventually he snaps the trap shut on Bulock after a year or two. So it's a great sort of story about how to turn something around from a very, very bad start, to put it mildly.
Describe for our audience some of the intelligence operations run by both Dudley and Bulock in Liverpool and elsewhere.
Dudley was doing stuff like he would have a spy pay off a clerk or in Dudley's lawyer's office, who is with the great name of Mr. Squarey, great name for a lawyer. Squarey himself was clean, but what Bulock was doing was getting all the material that Dudley was acquiring for the great legal case that he was building to bring Bulock to justice. Because Dudley's problem was he couldn't just kind of black bag Bulock. He has to persuade the British government to move on him, to let them to do it. Otherwise, you get into that Sanford problem of diplomatic crises caused by a little too much undercover operations where they shouldn't be happening. But so he's trying to compile all these legal documents, affidavits, witness reports, all this kind of stuff. But Bulock is getting a hold of all of it through this clerk who was copying it and sending it to him for months. And Dudley cannot work out how Bulock is outwitting him at every turn. It's like the guy can see around corners and he can see through walls and stuff. He's just being able to predict his every move just before it happens. So it wasn't just the clerk in the office, in the lawyer's office. Bulock had one of the best moles anyone's ever had. Now, mole is an anachronism at that time. but it's opposite in this case. And that was a guy who worked in the Foreign Office, British Foreign Office, on the American desk. He's a young man. He's featured in the book, and I talk about how he was recruited, why he did it, how he was paid, and so on. But he would see all the correspondence between the Union ambassador, Charles Francis Adams, who had his materials supplied by Dudley, with the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister's office, and he would give Bulock tip-offs about when a raid was coming, or what Dudley had on him, and so on. So that's one of the great intelligence operations that Bulock is running. He's just front running all the information. From Dudley's point of view, he does that. It takes him a while. But that sort of meme or cliche now about the guy, and he's got the sort of the cork board, and he's got the thousands of pieces of paper and this red thread attack going from one to one. It's all this weird conspiracy theory stuff. That's what Dudley's doing. He's a former lawyer, so kind of a local lawyer who's very, very pedantic and detail oriented, and he is very slowly putting together a web, a network, a chart of all of these front companies that Bulock is running, how they were all interconnected, how Bulock was funding all of this, where the money was coming from, how many ships were coming in, who owned those ships, because everything was just cutouts and front groups and front companies and so on. And he's eventually putting the whole thing together. And you can see it in the documents that nobody had really looked at before. But there's one point where he comes up with a list of no fewer than 230 or so front companies, dummies, that are being used to finance and to operate this illegal, to buy these ships and to buy and sell cotton and guns and so forth. It's an extraordinary achievement, and it's all done by him and sort of a clerk, and with the help of Mr. Squarey and so on, and some diligent research work. It's an incredible intelligence coup that he did. And that's how he realizes just how colossal this spider's web is that Bulock has constructed around him. And that's when he starts breaking it down. So it's a pretty extraordinary thing that he did.
Well, eventually the tide does turn. What were some of the key turning points as the North began to exercise more control over the situation?
Strategically and politically, the key turning point was the Emancipation Proclamation in late 62, where Lincoln announces that he's going to do it. In Britain, very few people believe that this is actually going to happen. They just assume, well, this is just usual wartime propaganda. He can't be serious. He's not going to emancipate all of it. That's crazy talk. The South obviously can't believe it, because nobody would do anything so crazy. And what happens is that there's a kind of you can actually detect it, and Dudley detects it, and he writes home about it in the documents, that in sort of 1862, there'd been just a couple of abolitionist meetings in England. And these were usually held in drafty little church halls, and there were 8 people there, and little old ladies knitting, and a couple of nice Quakers, and drinking tea and having some cake. And that was basically all that happened. After the Emancipation Proclamation, especially after it comes into effect in early 63, there's suddenly this wave of abolitionist meetings that happen. The big unions, the big labor unions in Manchester and Liverpool and London and so on, start holding very large meetings of thousands, and not just a couple of people in a church hall, thousands of people in meeting houses, in sort of grand theaters and stuff like that. There is this great wave, and Dudley is cruising on this, and he says that even in Liverpool, the most pro-Confederate city in Britain, this was a place where there were more Confederate flags being flown than anything else, than even British ones. They were all over the place. He says that even there's meetings of thousands of people. And what happens, that's the political switch. What happens on the ground in Liverpool in the struggle against Bulock is that Bulock is suddenly not in a dominating position anymore. He can't just call on all of these shipyards and be extended very lavish and easy credit to build ships anymore, because they're beginning to think, well, what happens if Lincoln wins? And also, the British government now is beginning to thanks to Dudley, take a more serious look at who we're selling ships and weapons to. And the South isn't doing so well. we're not going to give them such easy credit anymore because a lot of the cotton exports have been stopped, and we were basing all of our credit extensions on that cotton that was coming in. It's not worth as much anymore. So Bulock is finding it more and more difficult to find informants. He's finding it more and more difficult to build ships. He's finding it more and more difficult to just operate as he wishes. He's much more constrained. He's much more boxed in. Whereas Dudley is beginning to flex his muscles a little bit. He was in a straitjacket, like Harry Houdini. He's in a straitjacket, and then he can sort of loosen the bonds, and he can start moving again, an arm out. And that's what happens. The British government starts becoming they're not over enthusiastic. They kind of start putting a thumb on the scale for the Union, because they too have to make sure that they're on the winning side. So that's essentially how it happens. And once that happens, Dudley's got the wind at his back. He's also getting really good at his job. He's exposed that Bulock network, and he can start really moving legally on, and also in terms of intelligence, on Bulock, and really seal him into a box. And that's how it works out. And then he closes him down.
And what is the eventual fate of the principal characters?
Well, the South loses. I don't think that's a big spoiler. The funny thing is that it's very interesting that when the South actually eventually surrenders, it's 1865. It's always very interesting how victorious powers treat the losing side. And there's always political questions that have to be asked about who's punished and who's not. There was worries in Bulock's head that if he got taken back, or he went back to the United States, possibly he could be charged as a spy, as a foreign agent, which would cause him a lot of problems. So he stayed, but he probably would have been fine because the US government wanted to reconcile with the South as quickly as possible, and did some unfortunate deals to make that happen. Bulock decides to stay in England where he's safe. He also takes out British citizenship, makes sure that he can't be deported or anything like that. And he goes into the cotton trade. He becomes he does okay for himself. He makes some money being a merchant, and he's getting a little older. Dudley stays in Liverpool, but he's intending to go back to New Jersey, where he's from, and just take up his law firm. But there's something about Dudley having wriggled his way out of any form of recrimination, any form of punishment, any form of retribution, and who caused huge amounts of damage to the Union. He didn't murder anyone personally or anything like that. But this was a guy who basically allowed the South to keep on fighting, probably maybe even a year or two after it would have otherwise surrendered. He was the guy who kept the arms coming. He was the guy who kept it funded. He was the guy who built the CSS Alabama and CSS Florida, which sunk dozens of ships. I mean, he's not an innocent in all of this, though quite a charming and amusing fellow. So Dudley decides he's going to get him. He's not just going to leave him be and rest in peace. So it takes him a long time, but he persuades the American government to pursue claims against the British government for losses at sea caused by Confederate commerce raiders, Alabama and Florida and various other ones. So basically he sues Bulock. I mean, essentially, and this happens in Geneva, and it's a very interesting case it's called the Alabama claims, where the U.S. government decides that it wants to be compensated for all the losses caused by Bulock's ships. And it's a very long case, takes many months, so a year or two to wend its way through. Dudley is the guy supplying all of the material because he's kept everything during the war, all the proof of Bulock's guilt and culpability. And the US is pursuing big plans. I think they try and do a deal with the Brits where, I'll tell you what, give us Canada and we'll call it even Stevens. And the Brits say, no, we can't do that. And so they eventually come to, I think, an agreement of something like $15 million payable in gold. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, but if you calculate what that's worth then to what it is now, I mean, it's basically puts the U.S. in the black. I mean, it's a huge payment to the United States, and it's essentially the British government accepting responsibility for allowing Bulock to operate for so long without any kind of control on him. So yeah, in the end, no, Bulock doesn't go to jail. He doesn't get his just desserts, but he's humiliated and embarrassed. And yes, everything he worked for is torn away from him. And then Dudley goes back to the U.S. and he becomes like a director of a railroad or something. He just goes back into private life and eventually dies of a heart attack and that kind of thing. So it's kind of and other people involved in this go bankrupt or they get caught up in it or they disappear. It's an interesting story about what happens.
Well, it's a fascinating story, a true spy story, and I really want to thank Alex. It was a wonderful read. I recommend it to all of our audiences. It's The Lion and the Fox. Alex, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me on.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.